Good day, everyone. My name is Lebogang Peto. I'm a master's student in economics at the NWU. It is my honor to welcome you all to the 2021 Northwest University's Race Awareness Week. It is particularly important for us all, not just economists, to consider the relationship between race and the economy. It is necessary for us to recognize progress that has been made in South Africa to uplift people who have been previously disadvantaged. The World Bank's Overcoming Poverty and Inequality report shows us the latest available data, which indicates that around 2.3 million South Africans have escaped poverty between 2006 and 2015. While the coronavirus will have worsened the state of poverty in South Africa, especially along the lines of race, it is worth reflecting on the gains that have been made. But there's still much to be done. Just before the pandemic in 2019, we still had massive inequalities in terms of unemployment. Black Africans were reported as having 43% unemployment rate. Colored people were reported as having 30.1% unemployment rate. Indian people's unemployment rate was 20.6%, while white people's had only 9% unemployment rate. Startling statistics are also reflected in earning differentials, where Black Africans on average still earn less than what half of white people earn in South Africa. So too, a breakdown of the Black African workforce reveals that 18% are considered skilled workers, while in the case of whites in South Africa, the skilled workforce is 61%. These statistics emphasize that 3 centuries of colonialism and half a century of apartheid have left South Africa with massive challenge of changing the structural inequalities embedded within our economy and indeed our society. One of the main reasons for us hosting these cross-curricular events during RAW is to augment our learning outside of the classroom. This week is an opportunity for us all to learn, wake up, and to reflect. We encourage everyone attending this session to acknowledge that as a community that encourages intellectual discourse, that we need to ask the hard questions, but that we always remain respectful. That we push to understand better, but also know when to listen better. That you embrace being comfortable with the uncomfortable. As you watch the contributions made by the various speaker or speakers in each session, please feel free, not just to type questions, but even your thoughts and reflections in the chat box. You don't have to wait for the discussion section of the session. Please contribute via text from the moment we start with the session. If you are enthusiastic about unmuting your mic, you're more than welcome to raise your hand. If time allows, the facilitator will encourage you to unmute yourself. We hope that for each of you, this session will be the start of a conversation that leads to action just beyond Race Awareness Week. In closing, the patterns of race representations as well as gender and class demonstrate the longevity of racialized hierarchies of privilege in our country. Approaches to regulate, stimulate, and steer the economy are critical matters to contemplate as a university community embedded within broader South Africa. We look forward to your engagement. Enjoy. Geniet dit. Itumele. Lethabeng le rona.
Hello there. Welcome to the second session of day 1 of the 2021 Northwest University's Race Awareness Week. Thank you for joining us. So this webinar will be on Ndumiso Hadebe's journey as a young Black professional within the services sector. He has really done some amazing things, right? He's an alumni of the Northwest University Vaal Triangle campus and a former student leader. He's an award-winning economist and advisor that serves as the CFO and lead economist advisory. Yes, he has over 7 years experience as a finance and investment professional and serves as the board committee chairperson for finance, audit and risk at the Da Vinci Institute School of Business Leadership. He holds a BCom economics and is presently reading towards his MBA at Gibbs and has also completed the Alternative Investment Program at Harvard Business School in Boston. Now, in a few seconds, you will be watching a pre-recorded contribution from Ndumiso regarding his lived experiences as a young Black professional. We also have him on the other side, and I'm sure he cannot wait to start engaging with you. Just one thing, you do not have to wait until the Q&A session to share your comments and thoughts. Please start engaging in the chat box while watching the video. You can also raise your hand during the video and the technical team will take note of you during the Q&A and will give you an opportunity to ask your questions. So please enjoy the video and we will see you on the flip side.
Good day, everyone. My name is Ndumiso Hadebe. I'm the CFO and lead economist at Pax Africana Advisory, and certainly a proud alumni of Northwest University. And I'm certainly excited to be having this conversation with you today, especially as it is around Race Week, Race Awareness Week, and to really share my experiences as a young Black professional within the financial services industry. In thinking about this conversation to have today, especially in light of the racial disparities that, of course, do exist in South Africa. And of course, we've seen the level of inequalities, be it in income or wealth across the globe. I thought to really refer to certain anecdotes, experiences, pieces of writing that have shaped both my experiences in my working life, but also have shaped my perspective in relation to questions that relate to race, wealth, and income inequality, given the experiences that I've had. And one of the poignant pieces of literature that has really shaped my thinking and my experiences around being a young Black professional in the financial services industry was actually something of a lecture that I attended whilst I was actually still a student at Northwest University that was hosted by the Nelson Mandela Foundation. The Nelson Mandela Foundation, in this specific series, had invited a former minister by the name of Professor Ismail Seraldin from Egypt. And he had really an anecdote around some of the issues that I'll be sharing around my experience here today. And so to start this conversation, I'd like to start from his literature. And it's a parable, and this parable reads as follows, which relates to my experiences, which we'll get into later on. So this parable says, you meet 3 children with a flute, and they ask for you to help them to decide which child should get the flute. The first child is poor and has no toys, while the other 2 are rich and have many toys. The facts are not contested by any of the children, that thus it is fair to let the poor child have this flute that is in contention. Now he goes on to further to say, now consider that the same 3 children, but the middle child says she is a talented musician. She enjoys playing this flute, and she plays it well. The other 2 have no musical abilities at all, and they enjoy listening to her play again and again. Once more, the facts are certainly not contested. She should be the one who gets the flute. Now let's consider a third scenario, which states, again, the facts are not contested. The third child is certainly poor, that even if the first child is poor and the second is talented, he is the one who actually made the flute. He took the reed and made the holes and turned it into a flute. Surely it is not fair that he should not get the result of his own work. And then he actually goes on to say, now that we have observed this scenario, this is typically what the criteria that we use in the assessment of social choices: equity in the first case, utility in the second, and entitlement in the third. Now, given the history that we have in South Africa today, and being a young Black South African trained in economics, finance, and investments, my journey was was quite unique in the sense that I'm a young Black person that was raised by a single mother. And I think I've been quite fortunate to be raised by an educated mother who is a teacher. And of course, we do know the literature around what the prospects are for a child when they are raised by an educated mother, that they have better prospects of being healthier babies, knows that when a child is sick, what kind of medication that they ought to receive. An educated mother is able to assist a child that's starting with school, some basic numeracy, literature and reading. And so there are better prospects for that child to have a better upward social mobility in life. And so I had the benefit of that advantage of being raised by an educated mother. And throughout my experiences, to get to the point where I am now in my working life, I had a very I've always been very interested around what is the return on education for me as an individual, in order for me to really change the discourse of my family and that of my community. And as a result, I've been very active in community life, in the work of development projects, youth development, and programs that really uplift communities and young people. And what that had, how that contributed to doing the work that I'm doing today is certainly that whilst I was still at NW, I'd entered a youth leadership competition called One Day Leader on SABC1. This was back in 2013. This youth leadership development program was certainly a program that aimed at unearthing youth leadership talent and also really giving the spotlight on important development programs and initiatives that are driven by young people in some of the most vulnerable communities that we have in South Africa. And so I had the good benefit of being selected for that program and also ultimately winning it. But I would not attribute the winning of the program without what I understand to be the benefits that are associated with me, number one, acquiring an education, secondly, having attempts of succeeding in acquiring of that education, but thirdly, also building the kind of social capital that is required for me to be able to succeed in the work that I do. And as a consequence, I was given the opportunity by one of the judges, Mrs. Putim Mahanyela Dabengwa today, who's presently the CEO of NASPERS in South Africa, to work for an alternative investments holdings firm, which was then called Shanduka Group, previously owned by the current president, President Cyril Ramaphosa. It was since acquired by Pembani Group. And it was there when my experience in the financial services sector then started. I started my work there as a research analyst, and it entailed a number of things. It entailed looking at alternative investment projects in diverse industries, be it in mining, in retail, in investments in financial services, looking at the deal structures as they pertain to broad-based economic empowerment in enterprise and supply development, and drafting position papers in relation to such investments, both that are for empowered transactions and others that are traditional transactions that are being delivered. This certainly was my first experience in the financial services sector. Given this experience, I then had to probe around, given where one has found themselves, has my upward mobility been attributed as a result of class, given that I have a certain level of education, I have been able to build a certain level of social capital and so on and so forth? Or has it been as a consequence of race? Race being a young Black man, of course, I have a lower base starting point compared to perhaps some of my other peers. And what does that certainly mean? Even during that process, some of the ventures that in the past, entrepreneurial ventures that I've ventured to start, more so in the, given that I've been operating within financial services, but specifically within alternative investments, What does it look like for me to undertake an entrepreneurial journey, which I'm presently in right now, running my own advisory business, to be able to attract venture capital for the purposes of certain technological innovations that I may have attempted in the past, both by myself and other business partners. And this led me to an interesting and very critical area of inquiry as to what is the role of my education in the success that one would have in attaining some kind of capital to drive a business initiative. What is the role of social capital? What is the role of wealth and income in relation to my prospects of succeeding or not succeeding in these endeavors? And I would, lo and behold, I think the period was in 2015, one of the entrepreneurial ventures that one had started. It was a technological innovation in nature. Certainly, it was what we had developed at the time was an online marketplace where buyers and sellers can meet, specifically focused on rural and township economies to drive economic activity between those regions. Because when we were assessing some of the literature that is available around spending patterns, one of the things that we learned from the literature was that folks that are based in the townships, for instance, tend to spend or allocate a lot of their spending outside of the communities from entrepreneurship and so on and so forth. So that was really the premise around this technological platform. It was an app, as it were. And at in that period of time, we were looking at what it looks like to use our own capital, our own savings that we had put together from the earnings that were derived from the jobs that we were working, for me, within in Shanduka at the time. And to also see what prospects we would have to be able to attract capital in order to scale and accelerate the growth of this particular platform. Lo and behold, that platform, although we were since able to compete in a competition in Los Angeles and get second place in that competition, and we're able to get about, I think it was $5,000 seed funding into the platform in the US. In South Africa, it did not fly. Unfortunately, there were some structural impediments that were associated with that. And one of them was in 2011, the venture capital space in Africa was at an estimated $25 million. And over the years, when we look at the deals or the growth in the venture capital space since 2011, which was very nascent, which can be attributed to our prospects for success or failure. I think in this instance, failure is attributed to that at the time, the deal space for venture capital was quite nascent in our context. It is only in 2019, pre-pandemic, that we've seen that there's been a growth to about $2.1 billion of capital that is available in the VC space, both in the quantum and also in the size and the number of deals that have increased over that period of time. That is the one proponent or structural impediment that one can attribute to that. The second one is certainly that even if we look at the asset management space in South Africa today, there's only about 18% of Black asset managers manage current assets in the South African context. And this kind of data, I think, in my experience in the financial services sector, is very important, given the important role that finance and capital or wealth broadly has to play in improving and enhancing the upward social mobility of individuals across the board, be it Black, white, Indian, Asian, and so on and so forth. It becomes a very important enabler in being able to do so. And so therefore, understanding the concentration of capital in the marketplace is an important determinant as to the prospects of one's success or failure. So again, it then led me to therefore ask the question once more, have my experiences working in financial services and today being an entrepreneur within the financial services sector, offering transaction advisory services and research data analytics and so on, is it a class question? Are my prospects for success attributed to the class the social class or economic class that I'm attributed to, or is it a question of being Black in the South African case? This question is a very difficult question. It's a question that I continue to grapple with today for a number of reasons, more especially after having come across the work of Dr. Derek Hamilton, who is an American economist who deals with this question in the American case quite broadly. He was an integral player in the policy formulation of presidential candidate Bernie Sanders in the previous US presidential elections. And he drove this kind of policy. And there's something that he said in a town hall meeting that really sparked my thinking around this question as it relates to my own personal experiences and observations of racial disparities, wealth and income inequalities in the South African case and in my own experiences. And this is what he had to say about this question. Whether it is class or is it race, this is what he had to say. He says that it is not just wealth as an outcome, it's what wealth can do in your life. For example, if you are 18 years old and are faced with expensive legal issues, wealth will allow you to address those issues. The same is the case if you have expensive medical bills or want to start a business or even accessing and succeeding in the higher education sector. Wealth gives you choice, freedom, and agency. He goes on to say that astonishingly, it is race and not class that is the biggest predictor of outcomes in one's life. And he says this in the American case to say Black Americans in the case of the US have 10 cents to the dollar of wealth compared to white Americans in that context. And this data that he cites includes home equity. So even home ownership, Black folks still have 10% to a dollar compared to white families. Then he goes on to further to look at, is it a question of education? Is there a return on education or the disparities that are associated with that? What is driving or the underlying drivers around these wealth and income disparities? What he finds is that a Black household that has two parents who have a college degree is still worse off than a white family that has both parents who do not have a college degree. So then he goes deeper into trying to understand what are the drivers of wealth, what are the drivers of income inequality. And again, he says, as opposed to class, race in the American context serves as the biggest predictor of the outcomes of one's life. Now, this brings this question in my own context or in our own context as young professionals. And we begin to rekindle and reconcile some of these challenges so that we're able to create an equitable platform and environment where Black or white can have equitable opportunities to have an upward social mobility. And of course, some of the stats that you would know in the South African case, certainly, for example, where Black Africans are certainly the lowest wage earners in the South African case. And one of the biggest drivers of income inequality in this instance is as it relates to earnings in this instance. So in my experiences, therefore, when I look at the sort of deals that are being put together in the alternative investment space, when I introspect around my own experiences, what gives me the better chance or prospects for success? Without a doubt, education has been a very, very important enabler for me to be able to be in the spaces that I need to be in order to drive growth and development, not only for the purposes of my own family to take us out of a particular situation to the next level, but also for the development of communities. Because when looking at the work that I've done across South Africa in different communities and even representing South Africa across the globe, it becomes quite important that having a certain base of education enables one to be able to do so. Then there are other things when one is in business and has undertaken entrepreneurial ventures. there's a saying in business that people only do business with people that they like. And as individuals, we all have different biases. For instance, as a young Black man, I have certain biases that I would have. I think in one of the classes that I had, as I'm currently doing my MBA, one of the things we were discussing in human behavior was that you would find that if you have a cohort of people of different races, white, Black, Indian, Asian, and so on and so forth, there's a tendency to want to have initial conversations with people who look like you. So for instance, one would want to have an initial conversation with another Black person. A white classmate might want to have an initial conversation with another white person. An Indian classmate might want to have another initial conversation with an Indian person because of the biases or societal biases that we have. And we see these dynamics of psychological biases that we have as human beings coming to play even in the marketplace when we're interacting in business. Because if there's a saying in business that people only do business with people that they like, certainly it contributes to whether or not you're going to enter into a certain transaction with another individual or not. And these, I think, given the experiences that I've had, given the literature that I've had the opportunity to engage, and really certainly just being a student of life, I think it's important to really then delve into as to say, what are the drivers of these biases? How then can we reconcile so that we understand that we certainly have more in common with one another than what is different. We certainly have the same aspirations. We want healthy families. We want to ensure that our loved ones are safe and protected. We want to ensure that our prospects for being able to earn a living and be fed are certainly met. The basic human needs, we all have the same prospects. And this notion and idea of Ubuntu, that I am because you are, becomes the fundamental basis from which we build societies, is a critical area that I think this conversation and the Race Awareness Week, certainly in my lens and in my view, really ignites for us to be able to explore how we can be able to leverage that question. So in my experiences, certainly in the financial services sector, given the levels of concentration that are associated with capital, not only a question of class, but associated in a specific color of hands, be it from an asset management perspective, be it when we look at employment, earnings perspective, where earnings are concentrated. All of those dynamics are certainly the outcomes of underlying drivers that are driven by biases that certainly lead us to asking the question, is it class or race? And certainly, I think, given the work that has been done by the likes of Dr. Derek Hamilton and many others, one may therefore argue that certainly race is one of the predominant drivers and underlying drivers of these prospects and outcomes. The question, given the South Africa's history and where we come from and the nation that we want to build, is how then do we reconcile those questions? And that's certainly a conversation that I'm looking to have with each and every one of you to really explore what are your thoughts and thinking around how we can be able to do that. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to this conversation with you.
Wow, thank you so much, Ndumiso, for your wonderful contribution. I think, yeah, a lot of, some thought-provoking points to take away. Now we're going to move over to the chat box to see if people have shared their comments and thoughts on the presentation. And yes, there is from Hendrik Mwabi, who's asking, can we still say that education is an enabler in the current South African? Or should we rephrase to say we need to learn to connect and network so that those can, enable us? I'm not sure if you got that, Ndumiso.
I did. Thank you very much, Precious. I did. Thank you very much. And thank you to Hendrik for that very important question. I think what I've learned, Hendrik's question is quite important, and it's important for the following reasons. Number one, it touches on the point of how did we understand education to be, and how should we understand education to be given the current environment we find ourselves. So traditionally, I would say, we would interpret education to be of course, within the boundaries of the four walls of a classroom. But I think this notion that Hendrik is driving around learning to learn and to connect more is actually one of the outcomes that came out of the work of the academic that I was citing in that address. He was asked a question at some point to say, what are the key enablers that drive upward social mobility across the racial lines? And he said that there are top three, and I'm not going to cite them in any particular order, but then refer to the one that he listed first. He said the top three are, he did cite education, he cited networks, and he also cited capital or wealth, the wealth base from which you come from. Then he cited a whole lot of other things, such as the economic environment that you find yourself in, and so on and so forth. And he said, out of all of those enablers, wealth, education, and so on, he said networks is number one. So again, he found some kind of scientific basis around who you know is actually what matters the most in driving upward social mobility. And then, of course, supported by all of these other things. So when Hendrik highlights the question of education, should we still say education, or should we say learning and learning to network more? I think with any good economist, it also depends from the base from which you come from. So as a Black person or as a Black young person, I cannot imagine being the board chairperson of a finance committee without any form of level of education. No one's going to take me seriously. I wouldn't know what I'm talking about. Firstly, because I'm Black. And then secondly, what is the credibility that I come with to be able to drive that kind of task? So for somebody like me, who's a young Black professional, that base of education becomes quite important. But secondly, also looking at education beyond what I learned from the classroom. Education in the sense to say, how do I interact with people? Do I understand the behaviors of people? Do I understand the incentives that drive people in a certain context? Am I engaged with the people that I work in? And that approach to sort of lifelong learning, I think then drives this ability to build these networks that enable us to have a greater or upward social mobility. And I think it's reflected even when we look at the stats from Stats SA, to look that the highest levels of unemployment are for young people who have below matric, for example. And it's also associated to say, look, for example, I know Precious, who's an academic and a doctor today. It's unlike somebody who does not have matric and does not have access to somebody like you, Precious. By virtue of having somebody like you in my life, I have access to certain information and insights that I can be able to use in respect of other opportunities. So I think Hendrik's inquiry is quite pointed, and it speaks to this question of an approach to lifelong learning as an enabler to driving upward social mobility as a Black professional. Sorry, Precious, I think you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. Zoom fatigued. I think just to add on to what you're saying, that perhaps we need well-rounded, graduates over and above your qualification, right? Because all of those will add up to like you said, creating this network of people. All right, I think now I'm going to chat to Ndumiso, and we'll look at the chats in a bit. From your presentation, I think for me, the main takeaways, where the intersection between race and class being the determinant of, life outcomes. And even though there's so many aspects, right, to each of these factors, race, remain the main indicator or predictor in life. Can you please elaborate on this?
So I think even oftentimes the conversation or the debate around what are the determinants of upward social mobility, or I think in the South African context, the debate around transformation and what it means. Why is it that we should have a broad-based Black economic empowerment policy position versus not having it and just trying to grow businesses and growing the economy, and perfect market conditions will then be able to drive this kind of transformation that we want, where then Black people will then catch up and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
I think the reason why I liked that particular point is it's for me, that view is a bit limited. It's limited because it divorces itself from the practicalities of what happens in day-to-day life. So it's good in theory to say, create perfect market conditions where there's perfect competition that will drive down prices, and that the best players, based on a meritocracy of some sort, will be able to give the market what they can. But then you find a Ndumiso who, for instance, I come from a rural area. I think, I don't have any track record of in my generation of people who have been in business before. So everything that I'll do within business, I'll be learning and failing quite significantly. And also when you compound it by the high failure rates of startups in South Africa, but also linked to global patterns, it means that my chances for failure are significantly higher, because if, as Ndumiso, when I turned 18, for example, my parents didn't have money my mother specifically didn't have money to take me to university. I had to find certain jobs and so on, compared to another peer who comes from a different wealth base, which can be attributed to the wealth benefits of indeed colonialism and what the apartheid system also did for certain racial groupings. They would have, for instance, 100,000 to be able to start university, or 50,000 or 20,000, and Ndumiso would be at zero. So that already is a different wealth base. It therefore means that if we were going to start the race at the same time, for me to catch up with that person, I'd have to do extraordinary things to at least catch up or even exceed that. Oftentimes, because of the sensitivity of this conversation, it's easier for the discourse to be put across class lines as opposed to racial lines, because of the sensitivities that I think are associated with race. But when you look at the data, and I was having this conversation, I think, with Michelle the other day, that there is, and of course, correlation does not necessarily mean causation in this instance, but we see a greater level of causation when it relates to indicators of outcomes of upward social mobility or wealth, when you look at race, as opposed to when you look at wealth, the wealth base from which someone comes from. And so it raises very important discussions. And I think every Black business person today has some level of contention, for example, with the PFMA, the framework for public procurement from government, for example, where there are certain things, and I think it's also related to this debate that's presently going on, where South Africa is bringing in Cuban engineers to assist with water treatments and so on and so forth. Yeah. And some of those issues are related to the lack of transformation in these sectors, where you need to have a certain base in order to compete at a particular level in industry. Now, when you assume that each and every participant comes from the same base to be able to compete, with the history that South Africa has, it becomes a very limited view to look at this particular instance. And then ultimately, it's no longer developmental for the broader objectives that we'd want to achieve. And so that's why that particular point I thought is very important, and it has practical implications for us in terms of access and success in higher education, for one, in terms of the successful prospects of SMMEs and business alike, in terms of what policy making looks like when it looks at special economic zones and making provisions for opportunities for participants and so on. And so there are very practical race implications to that particular point. And so that's why I thought it's important to raise it.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. And okay, would we then say, obviously, I think since 1994, Black people have been exposed to, a lot of resources to try and at least catch us up, right? And in your presentation, you mentioned bias now, right? Do you think that psychological or sociological bias has an impact on Black people's progress in life? Like, in other words, do you think that Blacks right now are still suffering from inferiority complex, in this new South Africa?
Mm. That's a very interesting and very important question, Precious. I definitely think that there is a great level that psychological biases or an inferiority complex that Black people certainly do struggle with today. And it started off, I think, as structural, but is now systematic. I would say even today, even some of the people that I look up to in business or in scholarly work who are Black have mentioned that when they find themselves in certain spaces, they have to talk themselves out of that conversation of self-doubt because I'm Black and I'm in a room filled with people who have been in this game for quite some time, and I'm the only Black person in the room, for example. So that is at the level of somebody who's at a certain social class level. Now you can imagine when it comes to language barriers for a young person who comes from a rural area and is a very smart individual and all of a sudden has access to going to university. This person has never touched a laptop, does not know what a mouse is or what it feels like. This person finds it difficult to translate a specific English word into their own mother tongue in order to understand it and reinterpret it so that to demonstrate it that they're actually learning for understanding. All of those issues have serve as an impediment towards a Black individual being able to progress in a certain context. So, and given that economies are driven by economic agents and these agents being people in the main, what are the underlying drivers for people to be able to succeed or not succeed? And human behavior and the psychology that we have plays a big part for us to be able to do that. And so I think it's one of the biggest things that certainly Black people have. Sometimes we see instances where Black folks are able to use it for their benefit. And then sometimes we also certainly do see instances where we use it as a justification for not doing certain things. So that becomes another discussion to say, let's lean more on the former than the latter. If certainly we want to see the kind of progress or social progress that we envisage.
Sure. Thank you for that. I think someone has a question from Hendrik. It still links to what we're talking about. He's saying, Ndumiso, enlighten us if you have ever encountered the imposter syndrome within your journey in the financial sector, and whether was it triggered by the organizational culture that you would find yourself in, and how long did it take you to develop cultural intelligence within the financial sector? Sure.
That's a big question. I think imposter syndrome is something that one still struggles with today. I think it will take some time to really get over that. But again, it has required for me to continue to do the self-talking. Fortunately one has the benefit of having all of this education and understanding the dynamics that I'd work, and my role as a role player in this context in order for me to really overcome those kind of dynamics. When I started working though, I think my journey was, I was quite fortunate in the sense that Shanduka Group was an investment company that was owned by a Black person, President Ramaphosa. And so even the culture that was in the company was unlike other alternative investment companies. It was more integrated than most. And for that reason, one of the ladies, as a research analyst, one of the ladies who was a senior to me, very experienced and mentored me quite a lot, was a white lady. I won't say her name, but we even had an office name for her where she called herself Mbali. For the purposes of creating this sort of integrated workplace culture. And I think for those reasons, I derived the benefit of understanding what it looks like to work in an environment where there are people of different races, be it white and Black, colored, and so on. And we're able to leverage each other's strengths and abilities to create the kind of environment that is conducive for all of us. In addition to that, when I did start out, I certainly had this view that I'm a young graduate. I don't have any experience behind my back, especially in this space I'm learning. And again, there were all of these expectations after winning one day leader to say, hey, this is young person will do this, that, and the other. And I'm like, not so much. I've never done this before.
Yeah,
So it was a big imposter syndrome to say, I cannot afford to disappoint, especially because I'm a Black young person. It's going to confirm the narrative that you see. You provide opportunities to young Black people and they disappoint. From the simple thing of formatting an Excel spreadsheet appropriately and putting together a presentation that is appropriate that my line manager or my senior can be able to present to their stakeholders. From a simple task like that, those are the challenges that I had. And what I found is that a simple task, I would spend, for instance, if there would be 2 hours allocated towards a specific task, I'd spend like 8 hours at that task, meaning I'd also have to stay after hours to be able to get it right at a basic level that they have the expectation to receive that task. But over time, then I got better. But that imposter syndrome is something that is always there. And one way that I've found to be able to overcome it is certainly to be engaged and to, I think it's often a phrase, work harder than most people. And certainly have that self-belief that I certainly can be able to do, regardless of where I come from.
Yeah, very true. I think it hits everyone. It hits me. You know, I have a PhD, but then some days I'm busy working on reviews I would have gotten from a journal, and then I'll be like, I'm a fraud, you know? So I think it affects everyone. I think the best thing is to actually to acknowledge that it's there, right? And through self-talk, self-belief, you know, you can work on it and be better. There were questions from Khomoto, actually. Khomoto Malinga is asking, right? What can you give to a student from a rural area with regards to networking, right? Where to start, how to start? What advice can you also give to unemployed graduates in as far as, you know, networking is concerned?
So I think networking is a very important skill. And I think that given the importance of that skill, what I've found is that it forces me, even the biases that I have, for example, with a white colleague or an Indian colleague or a colored colleague or an Asian colleague, I have found that, and this is for me, again, I take the question of leadership quite seriously. Both self-leadership and being able to lead, right, in any organizational setup that I find myself in. For a rural individual, even if language is a barrier, even if I'm not fluent in English, or even if I'm not fluent in Afrikaans, what I found that people, I would advise that rural individual to play to people's senses. So as people, we respond to two types of senses, in my view. The first one is being intimidated by someone. The second one being being able to relate to someone. And that is achieved by being authentic. That authenticity to say, this is where I come from. I'm not the greatest speaker when it comes to this type of language, but this is what I'm all about. And also being interested in the journeys of other people, because lo and behold, other people also have their own insecurities that they have. And you find that once we speak to, oh, you also struggle with that, then you start connecting with people at that level. So even if I come from a rural background, another young person who comes from an urban background has certain challenges that they also have, that if we're able to be vulnerable with one another and actually communicate them and put them to the fore, then we understand that we have very similar connections than most. What you find is that a friendship develops out of that. 10 years later, you find that you're able to engage in some kind of business or some kind of opportunity because of that human connection that you had initially that crossed that barrier of race or class.
Sure. Brilliant stuff there. Michelle also asked a question. Could you reflect on the challenges you have faced in the financial sector that you think have faced specifically as a Black professional? Yeah.
So,
sorry for that. And someone has a question in addition to that. How did you overcome those challenges that you feel you face specifically as a Black professional?
Mm. So one of the challenges that I faced, and it was quite deliberate for me to operate in the space of alternative investments. Number one, primarily because I have a bias towards real economy type of stuff, not necessarily financial markets per se, stock markets and so on. And so I have a bias towards real economy deals and so on. But one of the challenges that I personally faced in the financial services sector is when putting together what we refer to as a a confidential investment memorandum, which in essence is an investment business case that one is putting forward for the investment committee to consider financing. I have found with a great level of difficulty that a lot of investment cases that have come from Black entrepreneurs have been looked at with a greater level of scrutiny and unnecessary probing, as opposed to CIMs that came from white entrepreneurs. That is something that has it has not set well with me. I think even today it's still the trend when we look at where capital is indeed directed. You find that oftentimes to reject a confidential investment memorandum of a Black entrepreneur is much easier than from a white one. So that's something that continues to persist in the alternative investment sector, but also I think financial services broadly. And so that's why you find organizations such as the Association for Black Investment and Securities Professionals to drive this kind of discourse around what's happening in the asset management sector. You would know as well that pension funds, for example, only 18% of Black asset managers manage the pool of pension funds in South Africa. And people who, when we double click, the people who manage these funds, it's you and I, Precious. We are individuals who have insecurities, who have biases. So obviously, if I have a certain bias against a Black person or Black people, my level of scrutiny is going to be different towards other races. So that's been one of the biggest challenges that I continue to face in the sector. And given how financialized the economy is, how I've overcome that, I think how I continue to try to overcome that is to really explore how much more better I can become and how much more excellent I can become at what I do. Because by ensuring that I'm driving excellence in every single thing that I do, I then deal with some of the stereotypes or pre-existing stereotypes that may have prevailed prior. And I don't think it's something that can be done overnight, but I think if each and every one of us are very deliberate about that journey to overcome that, but more importantly, inspired by the spirit of Madiba, try to even connect with people who are different from us. You then find that power of collaboration then gives birth to much, much greater things. I should say though, sorry, Precious, interestingly, one of my greatest mentors is a white man. So that contradiction is quite interesting. It also shows what can potentially be done once we're able to break down some of these barriers.
Sure. Benjamin has a question while we're talking about this journey of entrepreneurship and stuff. He's asking, with all the disadvantages that you've mentioned, right, with regards to Black people and you being in the entrepreneurial space, how is the future looking for future young Black entrepreneurs from your perspective?
So what's the outlook? Yeah, it's look, I think there's a long way to go for Black entrepreneurs. I think Black entrepreneurs have the big challenge of being very astute business people very early on. So you're bound to fail. That's a fact. I think one should accept that if one is going to pursue the route of entrepreneurship, you're going to fail, guaranteed. The important thing is to really fail quickly and also learn quickly from the failures that you have. And some failures might be technical in terms of how do you manage the books of your business? How do you manage the people that you work with on the projects, that you're working with? Or some failures might be interpersonal. The fact that I don't like a certain person or a certain grouping of people, and that has certain ramifications to your entrepreneurial journey. So it's important to fail and to really learn quickly in that failure, because that is what will accelerate your chances of succeeding much, much sooner. I think, secondly, the other advice that I would give is to really have an approach of lifelong learning. And this is in relation to both the technical stuff, but also learning about people in general. Oftentimes you find that people who are able to get the next deal or able to connect with people are people who are actually able to lead through storytelling. And storytelling that is able to cut across and relate to each and every individual. So those are some of the skills that I think Black entrepreneurs would need to learn quite quickly. But at an advocacy level, I think Black entrepreneurs need to continue to advocate around what transformation policies look like in terms of creating the enabling environment for them to also be able to compete and participate in the market, and also ensure that the transformation imperative is put forward as a discourse that should be commonly shared. I think that's a discourse that Black entrepreneurs should also continue to advance.
So, sure. There's a comment from Professor Verona Leendert. Glad that you talk about failure in a positive light, And then there's a question from Pindile Mdluli. Ndumiso, you mentioned that there is quite a low number of Black asset managers in South Africa. Do you think this can possibly be attributed to social bias, or is it perhaps a race issue in the financial sector? Why do we have, these low numbers of Black asset managers? Is it because of opportunities, lack of opportunities?
So I think this could be attributed to say, look, there are Black asset managers, but the number of funds that are managed by Black asset managers is much, much lower compared to white ones. On the one side, I think firstly, that is attributable to structural and systemic effects of the structural nature of the sector itself. Financial services is highly regulated. And so in order for you to participate in that space, there are very specific regulatory requirements that you have to meet. And so that certainly it takes a couple of years for you to be able to reach that, even once you've met those regulatory requirements. But once you've met those regulatory requirements, you then have to have the credibility that is associated with people saying, look, I will take this R500 million fund for you to manage to invest in a particular class of portfolios to derive this specific set of return. Now, if we are 20-something odd years in our democracy today, assuming that you are a Black professional that participated in the sector 20 odd years ago, you would have had to have had a very, very, very early start compared to other Black asset managers today to be in that space, so that when you say that you're an asset manager that has been managing funds for 20 years, that comes with a certain level of credibility. Now, if Ndumiso is going to come today and say, Precious, please give me your R500 million fund. I have 5 years worth of experience managing funds. Compared to a 20-year, 30-year, 50-year, 100-year asset manager, your bias is not going to come towards me.
Yeah.
But I have all of the regulatory requirements, and I've also performed relatively well in certain instances, market beating, but I still have 5 years. So there are some of those systematic issues that then translate in the biases that we have. And this is then reflected in the pool size that is managed by both Black asset managers and others of other races as well. So those are the dynamics that are certainly at play there.
Sure. Karu is asking a question. Do you think that our current curriculum, especially in the BCom field, is preparing students for the world of work, especially in light of the racial inequalities we have discussed in this session?
Oh boy.
Yeah, I know. A difficult
Yeah,
question. Yeah.
yeah, Precious, and you're an academic. I think you'll be on my case
Be
in this.
nice.
So
Yes.
I have a great appreciation for scholarly work, and scholarly work is very, very important, and that's how I lead my life. But what I found is that there are two sides that tend to be at play in work life or in business. The one side is people who have a very strong practitioner's lens. So they've been in practice, be it in the workplace or in business for many, many years, and typically tend to lack the academic and theoretical soundness that is required to drive the work that they do. And then it's reflected in things such as research and drawing insights and hypothesizing and in critical thinking. It tends to be reflected there. Then you have the other side that has a very strong academic and theoretical lens that at times is divorced from the practical realities.
Yeah.
And what I found, and so it would be academia and practitioners' lens. So in my mind, I always try personally to bring the two worlds together. I refer to it as pracademia, to have the strong academic theoretical foundation with a practitioner's lens. And I think for education specifically, that grounded academic foundation is very crucial to be able to acquire the skill set to think critically and hypothesize appropriately. I do think, though, that sometimes there are certain limitations when it comes to so what? So what does it mean in practice? What does me understanding or being able to draw the Phillips curve or the Laffer curve mean at a practical level when the minister is delivering his address? How is that applied in the practical sense in modeling the budget speech, for example, or taxation and so on? So I think that kind of practitioner's lens becomes quite important in curricula. And I found in certain instances, well, let me say in my journey, I only connected the dots after a couple of years of working when I continued to pursue my studies further. So I would say that in undergrad, I knew nothing about economics or applying it. I knew nothing whatsoever. I learned what I learned. I passed, graduated, moved on. And I think it's only at this stage where close to almost 10 years now of working experience, where those very basic academic concepts or theoretical concepts I'm now able to apply today. For instance, even in microeconomics, what does it look like to for market entry in a certain instance? I want to enter in a particular market, and what does that look like when modeling it on a specific curve, average total cost versus the quantities? If I produce so many quantities, how do I model that? And I found that that's what folks expect when they are looking for solutions from economists. So being able to have that solid theoretical grounding, but applying it in practical life. There was an instance where there was work that was required to be done for one of the big hospital franchises in South Africa. And they wanted to understand what is the valuation of their business. It's a group structure. And so, of course, naturally, they would bring in economists to try and model what that looks like. And it's very difficult because how do you measure the valuation based on the equipment that is there, the doctors that are participating in that hospital? Some are part-time, some are full-time. How do you incorporate all of that in the valuation? And some of those things then are then found in how you model the insurance for that hospital to be able to come to a particular evaluation. So those are some of the concepts or business problems that one has faced. And I think academics or curricula need to then explore what it looks like to have more of those real life business cases to these very fundamental business concepts. Because when we say we've produced an economist in industry, they then expect an economist to apply that thinking to a very complex business problem. And so I think there's a room there to really merge the two worlds in order to ensure that the graduates that we put out there for the world, for not only for South Africa, but for the world, are equipped enough to really solve very complex business problems. Sorry.
I guess it still boils down to the fact that we still need well-rounded, graduates over and above the academic qualification that you have, right? Yes. I think I wanted to ask you a question, right? You spoke about equity, utility, and entitlement, right, in dealing with inequality. Do you think inequality is subjective, right? Do you think it's subjective?
Subjective in what sense?
I mean, if I am a Black person and I feel that, I'm being, for instance, discriminated against, can then a white person still come and say, but I'm also discriminated against because of your own laws, like your BEE and, and all these affirmative action, in that sense?
Inequality being subjective. I would think that the root cause of inequality is subjective. So subjective, even from the fundamental concept of saying, Precious, you are an entrepreneur, you are my employer, and I am your employee. From your vantage point, you are the one who has put together the capital. You have taken the risk to be able to take out loans. You have put in the hours to be able to do what you need to do. So your subjective viewpoint is that you need to be rewarded, consummate to the efforts that you've put into this particular project. In effect, saying that you need to earn more than me. I am offering my labor, and as a result, I want to be rewarded consummate to my efforts. And so if there's an instance whereby you earn over 100 times than what I earn, and I feel that what I'm earning is not consummate to the efforts that I make, there's already that inequality that exists there. You're earning 10 Rand, I'm earning 1 Rand. You're subjective from the viewpoint to say that you've put out all the risk. I'm subjective from the viewpoint of saying I work long hours. I give my all. I sacrifice time with family. I do everything just to make sure that your entity succeeds. These are two divergent and subjective viewpoints that drive inequality. And so there's then a discussion to be had. So to answer your question directly, inequality's root cause is indeed subjective.
There's a question from Verona, Prof. Verona. Do you think the Harvard model of attending university for a year or semester and then doing some work integrated learning is a model which higher education should consider?
So the Harvard model, attending university for a year, is that for an undergraduate degree, or am I assuming that it's for postgrad studies?
Prof. Verona, do you mind unmuting just so you can elaborate on your question?
Yes, hi, good day. That's actually for undergraduate level. It's a new model that Harvard is starting within their business sector to integrate the work integrated model. So you go to university, say for a semester, you go into the workplace, you work in a company, you come back and what you've learned at the workplace. And then, it's this whole, in and out model that they are doing. So you actually take about 6 years to complete your degree, I think 5 to 6 years. But I think when you walk out, you are way better equipped to what you need to do to succeed in the workplace.
Sure. I think that's a very interesting model. I think one of the important considerations when I'm hearing from what you're saying, Prof, would be what would the application of the model look like in the practical sense? For instance, I think one of the comments that were made for students who might come from a rural context, and who might have to perhaps adapt to a certain way of thinking as an economist or whatever field of training that they're pursuing. But I definitely think that integrated workplace learning has a significant amount of value to be able to bring the two worlds together. I think from what I'm hearing, there's also a benefit that would be derived from the side of industry in terms of the question that graduates that are produced tend to be divorced from real business challenges. And so it would deal with that experiential work requirement for certain roles in industry. In terms of the duration, I would be interested in investigating that more as to whether additional years of schooling contribute to greater output and success for these students. So the duration question, it's something that I'd be interested in really finding out when exploring what are its impacts. But I think those would be some of the benefits, certainly, of such a kind of model. But in addition to that, I think it would be important to explore what it looks like practically, given where the students that we have in our universities also come from. Because, for instance, what pops up to mind is that an integrated workplace type of model would have certain requirements, such as being able to travel to that workplace back and forth on a day-to-day basis. Then it becomes a question of, if I'm a student, and when I was the academic officer at NWU, I was actually quite shocked to find that there are students who come from homes where they are supported by their grandmothers, and the annual income that comes into those households per year is 30,000 rands. Now, what that then said to me is that this student is supported by their grandmother, who earns a pension. It means that them traveling to campus every day, their grandmother takes from their kitty on a day-to-day basis for them to come here, assuming that they don't have NSFAS, or they have NSFAS, but there are certain additional things that they need to get. So that kind of model will be interesting for what it looks like applied for those kinds of students, because again, I would not want to have I would not wish personally to have models that are continuing to accelerate the disparities that exists from those who might have access to a model like that versus those who might not. So I think it would be an interesting one, and it would be an interesting case to look what it looks like in the South African case.
I forget with this meeting thing. I think it could also, have budget implications, right? I mean, we already have a serious case of, higher education funding in the country. Now, if we have to extend the number of years you have to spend at a higher education institution, more challenges. But I guess it would still be interesting to really see if it could work in the South African case. I think in the interest of time, your time is running out. I just have one last question, and I'm really pushing for a short answer, Ndumiso, please.
Okay.
Obviously, we know that discrimination is everywhere, right? And I mean, some people probably encounter microaggression, implicit biases, and overt discrimination every single day in the workplace. Now, how do we challenge these aspects and possibly deal with them?
How do we challenge these? I think sorry, but I think the recent development of the resigning of the former CEO of ABSA, Mr. David Minele, who was the former deputy governor of the Reserve Bank, raised a big debate around is it discrimination or is it company imperatives? So I think from the side of ABSA, the notion has been that it's been really company imperatives. We don't agree on strategy. We don't agree on strategy as it relates to culture and so on. But again, when you look at the culture and track record of ABSA in South Africa, and having a Black CEO is not a great record, as it were. So I think it's important as a result, and I was having this debate with one of my business partners, and he felt that there certainly is a shortage in the discourse around challenging discrimination. He had a very contrarian view. His contrarian view was to say, what I've been hearing is that Mr. David Minele has resigned, because of strategy and so on, and it's not good for the Black community or for transformation in the financial services sector. But he found that that line of argument is a bit limited, in the sense that we don't have an appreciation, or the debate has not been based on what are the differences that relate to the strategy that they're not agreeing on. What are the empirics and what are the real substantive issues that are associated with driving his resignation? So in essence, he was proposing that the debate should be centered around the substantive issues. And so I heard his viewpoint. And so that is to say that in challenging discrimination, I think that it's important to really have very strong and intelligent arguments that we put together to be able to do this. Over and above that, I think we also need to, again, understand that people respond to certain senses. People respond to senses that either intimidate them, or to senses that they can relate to. And so we found that, especially in the broader discussion around transformation, the reactionary, or the response has been to react to, okay, transformation again, roll's eyes, okay, you have BE, what's your issue? That's generally been the response. But I think when we are able to craft a kind of position that is able to ensure that even somebody who can't put themselves in the shoes of a Black person is able to relate at that level, I think that is a higher type of argument or position that we're able to put together. And I think economists and social scientists or thinkers alike, we need to really think hard around how we then structure our arguments for challenging discrimination in the various contexts that we find ourselves on, so that we just don't say, it's because, and then we don't have any substantive outcomes. So I think that that's a very, very important area to really focus on in ensuring that we're able to achieve the desired outcomes. And I think even in political discourse as well, it becomes quite important to have that kind of way of constructing and challenging discrimination.
Sure. Yeah, that was amazing. Thank you so much, Ndumiso, for your contribution. I think a lot of people probably have so many things to take away from this, and we can probably, continue having these conversations beyond Race Week. I really hope that it has sparked some sort of conversations with among people. I think we have a lucky draw for 10 gigs of data. So please stay tuned to see if you are not the lucky winner. I think I'm going to take this over to Noni. Yes, Noni.
Yes, good day, everyone. So I will be conducting the lucky draw for today. I have all the student numbers of everyone that registered, and the first student number that I pull out, that person wins the 10 gigs worth of data. So, drum roll. We have the student number 314-02364. I will repeat it again. 314-02364. I will also leave the student number in the chat box. Congratulations.
Thank you. Congratulations to the person who has won 10 gigs is a lot. I mean, I would do anything to win that. Thank you so much for all the attendees, guys. Thank you to Ndumiso. You could have been elsewhere, but you sacrificed your time to be with us today. So thank you so much. Until next year, please have a great week ahead. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much.